A lot of the fun of creation is the creation, and the hard work is all the maintenance and the support and the documentation after.
Developers don't want to make companies.
I think that a lot of developers don't know how.
Open source infrastructure needs a developer evangelism team, or it needs a community manager or something.
Or a sales team.
It's bad enough to get a snotty bug report from a customer that's paying you, but when it's from somebody who doesn't even give you anything.
The problem I have with calling it free labor is that I find it a little bit condescending to the intelligence of software developers.
In the end, money is actually really closely tied to open source, and we're just not talking about it. Everybody gets paid for open source.
Hi, I'm Paul Bigger, founder of CircleCI.
I'm Edith Eghbal, CEO and co-founder at LaunchDarkly.
And you're listening to Be Continuous, a podcast about continuous delivery and software development.
You can get in touch with us anytime at our Twitter handle @ContinuousCast.
The show is brought to you by HeavyBit. To learn more, visit heavybit.com. And while you're there, check out their library, home to great educational talks from other developer company founders and industry leaders. In this episode of To Be Continuous, Nadia Eghbal and Sean Byrnes join us to discuss the economics of open source.
So Nadia, what do you like best about open source?
I like that open source is where I feel I spend time with a lot of creative people. It's sort of like creative talent at its best, and it feeds directly back into the rest of startups and technology and everything else that I love. But it seems like everything starts with open source, which makes it really magical.
So Sean, what do you like best about open source?
It's the community. I enjoy learning from other people. I enjoy being able to find people I would never connect with that I have interests in common with, and the community that helps, because I consider open source to extend beyond just writing lines of code to sharing ideas and sharing concepts and sharing solutions to problems. And while I might not always use those same solutions, I'm always inspired for new ways to solve other problems.
So that's super interesting because nobody said that they like how it supports their Silicon Valley startup through sharecropping, or nobody said, like, I like how I get paid to work on it.
Sure.
Well, Paul, that comes later in the episode, but this would be a great time for our guests to introduce themselves.
Yeah, I'm Nadia Eghbal. I've been writing recently and thinking a lot about how to support open source infrastructure. Originally, I have a background in nonprofits and impact investing and working with foundations. But most recently, I was a founder of a startup, and then I went into venture capital and have sort of seen the system from all different sides and would love to marry together all those different interests and topics, which seems to happen in open source.
Yeah, I'm Sean Byrnes. I've been writing software most of my life. I've also been a founder of companies and an investor. I have been lucky enough to, I would not consider myself an expert on open source, and I don't want to claim that pedestal, but I am the maintainer of some open source libraries, which seem to be pretty popular, and I have contributed to others. And I think that I've been lucky enough to know a lot of open source developers in my life, which is by no means a majority of them, but enough that I feel part of the community at least.
So one of the topics that we were discussing just before the show started is this idea of how open source developers get paid, or if open source developers should get paid. So Nadia, it sounds like you've been talking about this for a while or thinking about this for a while. Can you kick us off?
Yeah. Actually, have a new thought on this topic from Michael Rogers, who runs Node.js Foundation. And he said recently, I think on the last post I had written, that everybody gets paid for open source. And I think that's a really great way to start thinking about it versus saying that nobody gets paid. Because in the end, we're contributing time to open source, right? And in the end, somebody is paying you to have the time to work on open source, whether it's your employer and then you can work on open source full time at your job, or you're full time employed and that gives you the bandwidth to be able to work on open source on the weekends or whatever. So when you think about paying people to work on open source, I think people sort of like bristle at the idea because they think that money is not involved in open source at all. And what I really liked about Michael's point is that in the end, money is actually really closely tied to open source, and we're just not talking about it.
It's interesting because my point of view is that it's actually more nuanced. I agree with you 100%, but I think that it's very nuanced in that a lot of people do get paid for open source. It's not even that we aspire to wanting them to get paid, right? Because there's lots of kinds of open source. It's funny because on Medium, Nadia and I had an exchange, and I kind of quantified it into the 4 categories of open source, the way I see them, which is by no means the universal standard, but at least how I see the world, there are places where open source is part of a corporate product. It's part of a whole. Like, LaunchDarkly, Edith's company, has open source SDKs. It's not because they're doing anything granted. It reduces their sales friction if their customers can see the code before they integrate it into their app, right? So that's one kind of open source. A second is what I call corporate open source, where there's an open source project, but there's a company that sells services and products and stuff around it, right? So Confluence does that for Kafka, and Databricks does that for Spark, and MySQL was, I think, one of the first companies to really make a good model out of it. Red Hat, you could argue, had mixed success, but that's another kind where there's a company whose corporate goal and sales is towards this project. There's the third kind, which I call kind of like corporate marketing, which is you take a project out of a company and you roll it out like LinkedIn did with Kafka, where they're actually the companies maintaining it. They just make it available. So Google with Angular and Facebook with React. And again, there, I think that it's, you could argue why companies do this. Some of them do it for recruiting, some of them do it for marketing, some of them do it because they're very nice people. But there, I think that the fourth category is where it's a little bit weirder, where it's like what I call like the community, where somebody started a project. Maybe it's an individual, maybe a few people to solve a problem. And a lot of the most important open source projects today started that way. Even Linux started that way, right? And it grew and it got bigger, and eventually then it became unclear because other people were using that project to build other companies and build other products and make more money. And I think in that fourth category is where I think it's less, because in the first 3 categories is usually pretty clear who's getting paid to do what and where the money's coming from. But in the fourth category, it gets very muddied very quickly. Because if I start something, and the metaphor I like to use is the open source library that I wrote was something called Likely.js, which is a recommender system for Node.js, where you can, like Amazon product recommendations. And I know that there are people in the world that are using that as part of companies. And those companies are obviously making money because they're using it to recommend products, right? And so the question is, so in that world, do they owe me anything for creating that, which is underlying their products? And then in turn, what do I owe to the projects that I built Likely on top of? And then where does the flow of economics in that world go?
So I have an interesting view on that. Years ago, I got involved in this project called PHC, which was a compiler for PHP. And there was a couple of guys who had started this, and I joined a year later. And when they started it, they made it GPL. When I joined, I argued we should change it from being GPL to BSD. Because if someone comes along and uses that technology to build something that's cool, I would rather that happen than that not happen. And it might be that if it was GPL, that it wouldn't happen. And so that essentially, in sort of the kind of related to Likely.js, you decided by the license whether or not you were going to make it publicly available, or if you didn't want people to build business on it, you could have made it GPL or AGPL or something along those lines, and you could have restricted it in any way that you wanted, and you chose not to. And there's something implicit in that communicates to people who are building their companies on it, etc., as to what your intent was.
No, that's true. Although there's a nuance in there, which is that even the GPL suffers from this, what Richard Stallman still complains about today, which is you could still use Likely.js on a server to produce a service without...
Well, so AGPL would work around that.
Sure, and there's other
solution
licenses that I could choose, but the majority of licenses out there today. But even then, let me argue the counter side, not because I agree with it, just because, hey, let's argue, because then it's more interesting. What's up? As an individual developer, I don't have the time or resources to go pursue. Like, I'm not going to go sue somebody. Really? Right. No, come on. Like, it's not going to happen. So I think you're right. Only in the act of releasing it as open source on GitHub, I was making a decision that it is possible for people to use this in ways that I don't intend. They could have used it on Silk Road to recommend drugs for all I know, seriously, right? Or to make money on it in ways that I am not going to benefit from. And I made that decision knowing full well the impact of that. And I would actually argue most developers do that. The question is whether or not there's like remorse later on when it turns out, wait, I really wish I hadn't made that decision and I can go back in time.
Well, I think this is a common thing that people create a thing and then they say, well, if this is popular, I could sort of keep it, or I could, there's value here that I could keep to myself, or I could keep the value to myself, or try to profit from it in some way. But they make what is essentially a marketing decision. I'm just going to release this. I'm going to see what happens to it. I'm going to see if it spreads, and then if it spreads, I can then make a decision as to what, how possibly I can make money out of this, or I can get value out of this. But at that point, obviously, the cat is out of the bag in terms of people actually using the software.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's actually should start from the principle, like you said, of it's really great when people, you give something away and then people can use it for whatever they want, whether it's for a hobby project, whether it's for illegal drugs or whatever, businesses, whatever. Like that's like kind of one of the coolest things about open source is that you can use it for whatever you want. And that's kind of what you signed up for, right? If you didn't want to do that, then don't license it that way. I don't know. I wouldn't frame, at least the problems that I'm seeing and that I'm interested in is not really about like seller's remorse, I guess, of, oh, I made this thing and now it's really popular and how can I make money off of it? But I think it's more really about investing back into the infrastructure that we're all using, and that requires some sort of maintenance and upkeep. And that's why I like the term infrastructure, and I'm trying to use it in that sense of things that don't have a business model or a business attached to it. Like you literally could not charge for Python. Like that's not going to happen. Or the packaging associated with it or whatever. But still, like millions of people are using it. It's touched billions of people. And you literally have like one person working on a library or a project. That doesn't seem, it seems like it's in everyone's best interest to make sure that it works properly.
Well, I think Nadia made a really good point that a lot of the fun of creation is the creation, and the hard work is all the maintenance and the support and the documentation after. So like Sean, you basically got the fun.
Oh, totally.
And then you just like...
Well, I mean, that's if you even think back to the original like Cathedral and Bazaar essay from years ago, I mean, that was one of the fundamental topics of Eric was inheriting, I think it was called Pop Mail from somebody else. I mean, he had gotten tired of maintaining it, and so he wanted somebody to take it over, and he found Eric, and Eric took it over. I mean, that's, I think, yes, as engineers, we like creating, and we like creating things in our free time, and we don't like maintaining them as much, and maintenance feels more like work. And so I agree with Nadia's point that if everybody is driving economic value from it, somebody has to be willing to step forward to support it. I think the problem is that it's funny that you have a background in nonprofits, because I also have worked for nonprofits, and I see the similar lament in nonprofit companies, which is that, or nonprofit companies, nonprofit organizations, where the person who starts it usually really wants to solve this problem. They're usually very good at that. They're not good at the fundraising. And in this case, in nonprofits, it's like raising grant money or getting donations. But they have a good mission and they have a good organization to go do it. And they have this lament, which is, why can they not get more support to solve the problem they see in the way that they want to solve it?
Yeah.
And I see the same around maintainers of open source projects. And I think the challenge is going to be that I wonder if it is even possible for the general economy to support them to do what they want to do the way they want to do it, or if they're going to have to start doing it the way the general...
Right, because they have other options. They can start a consulting company, or I think you called it a Category 2 company or something like that, to build around it and support it themselves that way. And then their job isn't what they wanted their job to be, which is making cool software. Their job is, doing maintenance contracts for a big soulless enterprise.
Like you say that like it's, soulless enterprises,
I'm a big fan of soulless enterprises, but I'm just looking to sort of put the...
They have a lot of money.
Yeah.
We have to sell them.
Yeah. And if any soulless enterprise would like to buy Circle CI, they should contact me for enterprise
just
pricing.
mention the code OSS for 10% more on your contract.
And by the way, thank you for wearing your Lunch Darkly t-shirt today, Paul.
Always. So Nadia and Sean had this conversation on Twitter a week ago, which led to them being on the show. And one of the tweets that got involved was from Jacobian, who's one of the senior Python kind of people. And what he said is, OSS developers deserve to be paid. SV, Silicon Valley, has made massive profits by exploiting free labor. This needs to end. And I think that there is this feeling in open source, or at least by a lot of people who end up on the maintenance side of things, that that there is a sort of a sharecropping going on here, and that something needs to happen about that.
I think Nadia actually put this extremely well in the essay. Like I wish I had written that essay. It was brilliant. But just like what's really fed this is the explosion of GitHub, and that it's really easy now to start an open source project.
Yeah, I feel like right now is just a time when we're so used to thinking of open source in a certain way, and things have kind of gone along as they have for so long that we haven't necessarily noticed or taken a step back that like the past 5 years look completely different from the past 30 years. And stuff is just not the same anymore. And in part, it's I think it should be framed as a really good thing, because it means that open source kind of won in a way. Like companies want things to be open source. They want to learn how to open source their own projects. They want to understand the whole thing. Everybody is defaulting to open source, and that's a really positive thing. And the question is more of not like, oh, we're exploiting people and that really sucks, but how can we help support that underlying layer that has helped make everything so great. It obviously needs some sort of reinvestment back into it.
Yeah, I mean, one of the most fascinating things about The Cathedral and the Bazaar, which was written 30 years ago, is that they referred to Linus Torvald as this charming guy.
That was the best part. Yeah, I laughed at that.
Yeah, I know. And like, wow,
funny.
he's this charming, personable guy who like persuaded people through sheer force of will to work on his project.
Yeah.
I mean, to go back to Sean's like example about a nonprofit, and everybody in the studio right now is like, whoa, that's not
Not at all.
by anybody's perception of it now. And I don't know whether that's just the grind down of having to keep maintaining a project or...
Well, I'd like to thank, I don't know if his name is actually Jacobian, but whatever it is, thank him for his service and work on Python. Because I think no matter what we agree on here, we can all agree that the people doing this are doing a service for the general community.
Definitely.
I think the problem I have with calling it free labor is that I find it, I think it's misleading. And secondly, I find it a little bit condescending to the intelligence of software developers that they're just being taken advantage of. Like they're somehow, they have no choice. Like there actually is legitimate free labor being abused in the world. People who have no choice. They have economic limitations. They have no options. I think the reality in software development is that no matter where you work in the world, software developers are a highly paid profession. People who can make money doing this. Maybe more in Silicon Valley than elsewhere, but people can make money doing it. And it is a challenging profession in that these people are smart and they understand the impacts of what they do. I think the question largely is, I really do think it comes down to the fact that there are people who have done work that is now being used in other ways, and what is the rationale and the economic equality that they deserve for that, right? So,
Right.
You think about some. I just want to go back. I mean, there's equivalencies previously in history, right? It's not like this is the first time in history that technology has been used in different ways, right? You looked at the ways that the telephone changed the economy and electricity changed things. I mean, these things fundamentally alter the way we function, and they can be used in ways we didn't intend. And I think that you think to all the original programming languages all came out of academic research. And then it was always going to be, university research has always been available to the general public. So it was always, as Nadia said, back then it was obvious. Now we have companies, like Go is developed by Google, right? So what does that mean? Does that mean that the world changed? Like Java was developed by Sun Microsystems. It worked out really well, but Java's never really been open source, right?
So to take his point a little more, and I don't necessarily agree with Jacobian's point here, but I think the feeling that he's trying to say is that there's tons of these startups who are making millions and millions of dollars, and they're building it on the free, and I'm making quotation marks which you can't see, but
They were great, actually, right? A good flourish and a nice wrist snap.
Companies are making millions of dollars on putting together, wrapping together open source libraries and open source technologies that are produced by people to whom they gave no money, and to whom they are sending bug reports, and who are then shouldering the maintenance burden, all for free relative to the companies that are using them.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of open source was based on, I call it the take a penny, leave a penny model,
Right.
where like,
Tipping.
I'll use this project, but I'm
I think
contributing
it was
back
actually
to
the take a penny.
Well, no,
Pennies
it was originally, I'd say, this very idealistic thing where it was coming out of universities. It was like, oh, you're working on this part of the stack, I'll work on this other part of the stack, and like we're all getting paid by research grants,
Right.
so it doesn't really matter.
Right.
And what's changed now is that it used to be that using open source was a very subversive thing.
Yes, totally.
Like it was sticking it to the man.
Right now the man is exploiting open source.
Yeah, so they won the open sources won the battle where you no longer have, like, I remember when I was started out, you'd have to fight to use open source.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I have a funny story about that, which I forgot to tell at the beginning.
But let me fit it. But now it's the reverse. Now all of a sudden it's like the big companies, in Paul's words, the soulless corporations who are filing the snotty bug reports. And like, it's bad enough to get a snotty bug report from a customer who's paying you.
Right.
But when it's from somebody who doesn't even give you anything, like
Right.
there's some legendary GitHub threads that you can read where basically somebody's like, you don't understand who's the customer here.
Yeah, exactly.
No, I mean, well, I'm not going to tell my funny story now because that would lose the moment. But I will say that, it comes back to me a feeling that there's this problem that exists where the mindset is I want to get paid for doing things the way that I want to do them. And I think that that's the challenge that I run into with this, which is they could ignore those bug reports, right? You could say, listen, I don't care what you think. Like literally, I mean, a lot of these projects, most open source, I don't know statistics, maybe none of it does. Most open source projects have a single maintainer. and almost always a single contributor. If you're very lucky, you get a full from. So there's almost always one person that's doing it. That person has the ability to do whatever they want, right? Even the most popular ones, right? Even though they probably wouldn't do this, they could, in theory, do whatever they wanted.
Well, that's the whole idea of a benevolent dictator.
Benevolent dictator for life, exactly.
Right.
So, but my point is, they want to get paid for operating this in the way that they want to operate this, and doing this in a way. And maybe that's not the right model. Maybe there's a point where these things turn over. I mean, what happens today? Often I see, not for Python, that's obviously not going to go away, but for libraries, and somebody will build one and they'll maintain it for a while and they get sick of it, and a few will pop up. So likely when I wrote it was the very first and only recommendation engine for Node. Now there are a dozen, right? I haven't maintained it a few years because frankly there's better options available, right? And so that becomes the circle of life where the community is maybe not contributing to the original project, but creating new ones that pop up around it to replace it and augment it, and it becomes this kind of free-flowing, free-form entity and community.
So I find it very similar to the things that journalists are lamenting about.
Yep.
So journalists are talking about we
used to get paid.
We used to get paid. We used to get paid a lot. We were the arbiters of what content was, and then all these people came along and they started making content for free, and that content isn't the right content, or whatever complaint it is, but a new technology, the internet, allowed anyone to write, and lots of people wrote for free, and it devalued what they were doing. And then the people who wrote for free found business models, whether it was like being able to get a job from writing, or YouTube royalties, or whatever the thing is. And there's this really strong parallel that the people who are maintaining the big projects are like, well, we want to get paid for this. How come no one's paying us? And the people who are maintaining the small projects and who are building it for free and are getting jobs out of it or getting consulting out of it or whatever are like, fuck it. I'm making billions of these. I do it because I like to write, and I don't care about your problems of maintaining Python.
Yeah, it was. So I tweeted this, and I'd like to expand on it, which was I think a lot of these free projects crowd out paid products. And it's I mean that in a very economic sense, that if there's 4 free libraries sitting around for recommendations, it's really hard to get paid for one.
And I think that makes perfect sense for projects on the level of the one that you're talking about, Sean, and especially for JavaScript libraries, and there's a lot of overlap. I think
no shade being thrown at JavaScript.
No shade, no, truly no shade.
Shade on this side of the table, I feel it.
Anti-shade. But I'm just saying that, there are plenty of, and I think that's sort of where all the fun and the creativity is happening, is oh yeah, I made this project and I'm going to put it out there, and someone else might make another one, and that's cool, and you can choose whatever you want, and that really mirrors sort of the information revolution in a lot of ways with content and journalism and other things, where music even, where you could just give it away and now paid products can't compete. I think that's actually okay and a pretty natural and expected development, and we shouldn't fight what's happening. But then there's still plenty of examples of projects like Python and its packaging, or Ruby and its packaging, or whatever, that aren't being supported at all. And it seems like you can't use a small project to explain why we shouldn't support a big project, because those big projects suck.
I think OpenSSL is a really good example
totally.
here. So OpenSSL had one maintainer, and it had some security issues with it that were basically, and everyone in the world was relying on it, and then everyone got screwed.
Yep, totally.
I don't agree. I think that if you think about how many languages exist today, how many options you have to choose between, I think that it is true that Python, you're not going to have 3 versions of Python that people are maintaining, but there's so many languages. If the Python maintainers are listen, we don't want to do this anymore, and they walked away from it, it's not like the world would end, right? I mean, the existing Python may not get better.
Oh, I'm going to disagree on this.
Good.
So if you look at all the companies and all the projects and everything that are being built on Python, the world would end. If Python went away, I mean, someone would come in and have to support it.
Exactly. That's
then
more,
why don't
more
we just
point.
do it? That's, I guess, the part. Why do we wait for a disaster to happen? I mean, even with OpenSSL, for example, I mean, they were asking for years for donations, openly soliciting, trying to get people to pay towards it. And it was only when there was this huge bug that suddenly everyone was like, oh my gosh.
So I have a strong opinion about this. basically they're asking the wrong questions. If you're going around saying we want donations or whatever, like
basically trying to kickstart.
Right. Companies actually really can't give donations. Donations are really fucking hard to give.
Yep.
What they should be looking at is companies and their risk profiles. So you have a company that is built on top of Python and they've no support contract and the whole thing could fall under them at any minute. They're definitely going to want to donate or give or buy or something that reduces their liability in some way, reduces their risk factor. And the idea of going around and saying, oh, we need money, please give us money, I think is ludicrous. And the idea that I've drawn up for this is basically someone should go out with literally a sales team, go to every Silicon Valley startup, every venture capitalist startup, every venture capitalist, everyone who makes revenue in the software business and say, give us 0.1% of your revenue or 1% of your revenue or somewhere in that range, and we'll make sure that it goes to the libraries that you rely on to de-risk that those things going away, the bugs not being done, all that sort of thing. And the idea that people would just throw their hands in the air and say, why won't anyone donate to us? Like, it should be a very proactive approach of going out to each of these companies saying, give us money, here's an LOI, here's my checkboard, bring out the checkbook.
That sounds a lot like a soulless.
Are they more
Sounds
likely?
like we're going back
So
to.
actually, with OpenSSL, I talked to. It was actually a very interesting setup, and I talked to Steve Marquez, who was at OpenSSL, just to understand that structure. And it was actually they realized exactly what you realized, which was even though people keep saying OpenSSL never got more than 2,000 donations a year, that wasn't how they were actually paying their bills. They were doing consulting contracts, and they brought in no more than I think $1 million a year, but it was more than $2,000. So there's Steve Henson, who is contributing to, or he was the one paid maintainer for a while at OpenSSL, and now they have a bunch of other people. And then Steve Marquez came in for this reason to say, hey, I'll write a little bit of code here and there, but really what I think you need is a little bit of a business mindset. And so he managed and continues to manage all of the contracts, all of the business services. None of the developers want to talk to clients, but he'll be kind of that interface. Even email, he says, don't ever email Steve Henson, just email me. I'll forward it to him if he needs it. And so I think that actually speaks to what open source needs more of is a business mindset, right?
So
sure.
I'm proposing something that's ever so slightly different to that rather than a single company rather than each company like OpenSSL having a business person who goes around and who tries and raise money or who sells the developers time for things, you have a single company.
So you have the United Way of open source.
You have the United Way of open source.
But then, Paul, you still have the issue, how does this United Way decide where the money goes?
Well, it's even worse than that. I think
you can look at people's gem files to determine where the money goes.
I'm totally on board with this. This is kind of what I'm slowly trying to move towards. So
I think
awesome.
I think companies are more likely when they get scared like that to hire a shadow maintainer than they are to donate to the open source project. You see this all the time. Companies that rely on big projects HBase and Cassandra, they actively go out there and try to they basically have shadow maintainers on their team whose job it is to be the expert on the source code to update it.
Companies typically use more than just HBase. They're using hundreds and possibly thousands of libraries.
We're talking about a class of projects which are the huge projects, like the programming languages,
right.
The big projects. Because the small ones, we've already talked about those. We can go back and talk about them again, but those are a different story.
Do we think that the small projects don't deserve funding?
I think that it's much harder to make a case for them because they live and die so quickly. I think it's really hard.
Yeah, I would liken them to art, which is how a lot of people think about code. And when it's sort of on that level, I think of it as art and creative expression. When I think about the big projects, I think about them like highways or roads or infrastructure.
Or cathedrals.
This is interesting. No one thinks that the small things deserve some sort of support?
I think that if you were willing to maintain one long term, maybe. The problem is they're just less complicated. So then you run into the barrier, if it was really easy to recreate Python, maybe we would, right? It's JavaScript libraries are one thing. I like to think about stuff I do is a little more complicated than that. But still, that's my personal opinion. There's definitely a gradient of the complexity of something. For example, in most places there is n number of implementations of a bit vector. It is really not hard to write a bit vector. If you really didn't like the ones out there, you could write it yourself. But a programming language is on the other end of the spectrum where it's really complicated. If you've ever done one, it's crazy hard to do. And on the spectrum there, if the smaller ones probably deserve, but the replacement cost is so low that you can just churn them through. On the higher end where the replacement cost is higher, this is where I think that if a company really was scared about the reliance on it, they're less likely to support the open source project where they have no control over what the money goes towards. If I give to OpenSSL, I personally believe that they would do something positive with it. But a corporation cannot make that bet. So I want somebody on my team who knows OpenSSL code that can improve it or change it in the ways that I need it. And I see that as my investment in my protection.
So I'm going to suggest that we're thinking about this a little bit wrongly, because the way that we're talking about big projects, big projects are infrastructure, small projects are art or whatever.
I disagree with that too. I think
Okay, guys.
it applies kind of a morality to the value of particular startups, or the value of, or not startups, of open source projects and the value of what they do. And really, the value applies to individual companies. Like a company derives a certain value from a certain library, and it doesn't matter whether it's a big library or a small library or a big project. It's that company should be putting money into its risks. And if its risks include a very small library that has one maintainer, but that is a key part of their drug recommendation engine, it's going to be up to that company to make sure that the money goes to the right places. And so the way of determining who gets money that I've been thinking of is like literally looking at gem files or looking at POM files, or whatever it is in your particular language. You can follow that dependency tree to see who actually is involved, what projects are involved in making your library, how much they're being used, and determine that way who should get support, or even whether there's someone down that path who is willing to support what you have.
Yeah, I mean, I actually totally agree. I think when I think of big versus small projects, maybe that's not the right term, but just the idea of like something that has critical dependencies, or someone or something like really, really needs this to work for their own purposes, then somebody should be supporting it. And also just kind of as a simple heuristic, like if a maintainer is asking for more support, they might need more support. And support doesn't always look like money, but maybe it's like, I don't have the time to work on this, I'm really stressed out, whatever. Like it requires some sort of closer attention. If a maintainer is really happy, I mean, Sean, you're happy with like your project and you're not asking for any support, then like we don't need to support it.
So the thing that this inevitably gets to is what happens when money gets introduced to open source. I wouldn't at all argue that open source doesn't deserve money and needs to keep doing it as art, but definitely...
Let's all agree the four of us deserve a lot of money. We can disagree on that, yeah.
But I think there's definitely an argument to be made, and I think that you've both made this, that people get involved in open source for intrinsic value, and it's not for the money largely. And so when you start to introduce money to it and you start to prioritize, and maybe people want project management and that sort of thing, and roadmaps and deadlines and that sort of thing, is money going to damage what we believe as open source, and how can we avoid that?
Or is the answer that really you have to help projects transition between, I laid out my 4 categories, whether or not you agree with them, but maybe if a project becomes really critical and has an individual maintainer, there has to be an infrastructure to support them transitioning to a different model, right? Where there is, we don't sit around worrying about what's going to happen to Spark because of Databricks is there. We don't worry about what's going to happen to Kafka because Confluence is there.
And they have the product managers and that sort of thing who talk to the customers, who determine the order of things and the priorities and the roadmaps.
And maybe the answer is that you have to help these projects transition. I worry that even if you followed back the gem paths or the packages, right? It's still not clear to me if you know exactly who to support and how. And yes, they want support. That makes total sense. But again, I worry about, going back to the thing I've mentioned a few times, is do they want support to do their project the way they want to do it? Or do they want to do support to do the project in the way that the companies want to use it, in the way that they want to go? Because it's not like they'll get money to just keep doing it. Like the money comes with expectations that you will do what I want.
Right. The money is for de-risking largely. And so there has to be some sort of maintenance guarantee or turnaround time or understanding that bugs are going to get fixed in order for that to happen.
So one point I quickly wanted to make in regard to like what happens when we introduce money into open source. What I had said in the beginning of this was that everybody gets paid for open source already. And I think that's a nice framework to have, because
you can't take that to the grocery store on Fridays.
Well, what I'm trying is, so for example, like Heroku is employing the core Ruby maintainers right now, right? And so like they have a full-time job and they're allowed to work on Ruby. And that works right now because Heroku is supporting them. Who knows if Heroku will support them later? Ruby is older than Heroku. But in the end, there's some sort of arrangement working there. We're not thinking about like what's going on with Ruby. Is it okay for that language because Heroku is paying somebody to work on it? So money is already there and already being used. We just aren't quite thinking of it as like as directly, I guess.
Well, it goes back to a lot of these open sources coming out of the government.
Yeah.
Who was really paying for this? Tax dollars.
The internet started because the government was funding it.
Yeah, so all those people who were getting a PhD were in effect funding this infrastructure.
Right. So yeah, money's already there.
Well, so it was.
But
You could say
money
it
isn't
was on the
tied-
back of somebody getting paid, $20K a year as a grad student. No, I'm serious. That's
Yeah.
why a UC Berkeley student gets paid, which is
Right.
pathetically low.
But money now, or money that's in open source now, is not being directed towards a particular goal or a particular agenda. It's being worked on the side or something along those lines. Although, yeah, I agree, everyone is getting paid, but they're not getting paid to do a thing largely. And so when companies start to support that, then people change from doing a thing because they like it or because they're using it for work and they feel other people could use it, to actually needing to support this for some other company's agenda. And that's it's a different goal, it's a different feeling, it's different from what I want to do in open source.
Well, Nadia, you've talked to the most. I know you've done so many interviews. Can you is there any common thread about people wanting to get paid or not wanting to get paid? What are you hearing the most?
Well, I think it's part of actually what Sean was saying around, do they want to get paid to do the same thing they've always been doing? And like life obviously just doesn't work that way, as nice as it would be. And so I think like community and funding are actually really closely tied. And I've tried to be careful to call it like sustaining open source infrastructure more than just funding, even though it kind of gets simplified to funding sometimes. Because it's not really about money. It's sort of just about like money enabling people to do what they already want to do. And so when I think about like introducing more money, let's say, to open source, it's really around like, how do you help enable a healthy, thriving community to exist? How do you help maintainers manage their time better? And yeah, I think it's like a very delicate question, and it has to be implemented by somebody who I guess like understands kind of, we're not trying to like change open source, right? Like it shouldn't be a centralized thing. You can't have, say, like an institution that is producing all of the open source infrastructure and it just like comes from this one place. That would be awful. You have to work with like each of these little ecosystems is completely different. Each of them takes pride in being very different from the other ones. And so figuring out how to coordinate all of that is actually probably the hardest part.
Although let's agree, if there was an institute for open source, you had to fill out forms in triplicate at the front desk in order to get in, to be able to review the source in the...
Yes.
Yeah. I'd say, so what is the tension here? Because like originally, I feel like a lot of this arrived out of, it was very organic, right? A lot of projects being created, and it was almost Darwinian in that something survived, and then it died, and something replaced it. And now we're kind of not willing to let it be that simple anymore. Like we're not willing to let the Python maintainers walk away because Python's too important. Like we're not willing to let it be Darwinistic anymore. Like we have to find some way.
I don't think that's it. I think we are willing to let anyone walk away who wants to walk away. I think that people are looking at money that is arriving in other parts of the ecosystem and saying,
Where's mine?
it isn't fair that
Where's
that
mine?
is going there. It is where's mine, but I feel where's mine is a very kind of pejorative angle
I
on
don't
it.
mean it at all that way. I
Okay.
just meant it more like I worked so hard on this with this idealistic view that I was giving back to the community, what Sean said, that everybody, and then I see all these people who are taking the code, not contributing back, and by the way,
Yeah.
being real jerks when they have a support request.
Yeah.
Right.
Like I think it's
So
again,
that's hard, but like who decides what's fair then? Like I agree with you, because it was funny I remember when Red Hat went public and all of a sudden the founders of Red Hat were filthy rich. And I remember being like, what the hell happened to Linus?
Right.
And then I read an article where like they did give him a bunch of shares of Red Hat and he used to buy a fancy, and I was like, I still was like, wait a second. He got a fancy car and they got like, that's not fair.
It's like the whole Kickstarter thing with Oculus VR.
Sure.
So a lot of people had kickstarted Oculus VR and they felt like they were part owners, and then they sold to Facebook for what was it, like 600?
$3 billion, I think.
Because it wasn't equity based. Yeah.
Yeah. So I feel like we've been kind of stuttering our way towards open source, perhaps needing money, that there's an issue of what projects survive versus wither. And capitalism actually has a pretty well-defined model for this. If a company can't find sufficient customers to pay them for their goods, they go out of business. And I think when I hear what Sean and Nadia and Paul are saying about like who decides how much funding to give to somebody, we talk about a centralized institute of open source. I'm like, well, wait a second. But I'm curious to hear other people's thoughts around this.
Well, I think there's a bit of a patronage, I don't know how you pronounce that in America, model around it at the moment that you could imagine that Python or something like that is the Sistine Chapel, and there's a Medici somewhere who's funding its development for basically altruistic or perhaps personal status reasons or something along those lines. And in fact, there's people who've been doing things with GitTip and Patreon and that sort of thing who are looking at that as a kind of a patronage model, which I think is a terrible way of funding these things relative to the more capitalist alternative, personally.
Well, it's interesting because they're kind of doing it after so there's two models. There's the after the hat, which we already talked about, after the fact, where you kind of go around saying, hey, we built this. And the second is I'm fascinated that now people are trying to kickstart software.
Yeah, it's actually a bunch of, I know like Django, RVM. I mean, there have been a bunch of crowdfunding campaigns around funding development, but it's hard, right? Because developers already don't want to spend time marketing themselves. Everyone agrees that, I mean, even outside of coding, that Kickstarter campaigns are a lot of work. And you can only really do it like once, or maybe twice, until people are kind of tired of you. And I don't think I've seen one that's gone much more than like 50K or so.
So I received a cold email a while back from Ruby maintainers, and I'm not sure who exactly was involved in it, but they were looking to get funding to sponsor the kind of Ruby ecosystem, RVM,
Yes.
and the servers that go behind Ruby gems and that sort of thing.
They did it.
They made it.
Yeah.
So how much can you?
Yeah, it's
you know
called
more?
Ruby Together, if we're referring to the same thing. I think it's actually a really great model as we talk about sort of like how do you direct more money without it turning into this like weird capitalist business. And I think it's actually really important to decouple infrastructure from business models for that reason, because you're not selling things and you want to sort of like, it's more of saying like, we need this to be good so that all the other business stuff on top of it is good. And so, yeah, Andre created this thing called Ruby Together. I think it's structured as a 501c6, so a trade organization. And he got a bunch of recurring donations from companies and from individual developers to sponsor work on what he calls Ruby infrastructure. And so I think they mostly do Bundler, Ruby Gems, and rubygems.org. And part of it was because of this, like some of these things that we've talked about where, like, for example, there were a couple of companies that were funding or basically employing maintainers of different core Ruby projects. And once they lost that support because it just didn't contribute to the company's bottom line or whatever, no one was maintaining these projects for a really long time. And so I think like Ruby Gems went like a year without anybody committing to it, which is crazy. And they had issues like where somebody hacked into Ruby Gems. I think it was a couple of years ago.
I remember that.
Yeah, and so nobody could take care of it because it's a volunteer system, right? And so nobody is responsible, and everybody has full-time jobs. Some people.
I remember in that particular case, someone was away or something. So
Yeah,
it was
right.
There was like 12 or 24 hours before anyone actually looked at it.
People had to take vacation days from their job to work on it, which is incredibly nice of them to do for everybody else, right? So it's stuff like that that I think they want to help prevent.
So how much did they raise? Who did they raise from?
So they're very transparent on the website about all of this. I think, I haven't checked recently, I want to say they have maybe like 16,000 a month recurring, and they're trying to grow that. So I think they
That
just
is ludicrously
started.
small.
Yeah,
Like
that's
It's really, really small,
Right.
which is
Now,
kind of
the
crazy.
important
right?
thing here is that it's recurring.
It's
Like
recurring. That's
the-
very important. Yeah.
But still, that's barely one full-time person
Yeah.
at San Francisco rates.
Yeah, and it's a shame, right? And more people should be donating to it.
How is it so
I just
low?
think
Like,
the whole donation thing is fundamentally broken.
Well, altruism, unfortunately, if you worked in nonprofits, you know altruism is this great thing that is a very short well.
Well, so
Like,
this isn't altruism by any means. This is companies who like possibly went down on when Ruby Gems went down, saying like, "Fuck it, we can't do that anymore. Or, we lost X amount of money, and I'm willing to donate 5,000 or whatever."
Listen, I think if it was clear if I donated my $5,000 that wouldn't happen again, it would be different. I don't know that I have trouble believing corporations see the math being that simple.
But they should. I mean, because if someone were dedicated full time to Ruby Gems, for example, if something went down, they would get it back up, and that didn't happen because nobody was working full time on it.
Well, so if you're a corporation, do you try to support the Ruby Gems project, or do you find ways to isolate your service and your product away?
I mean,
from
you do
Ruby Gems?
both. Like, but fundamentally, if you're based on Ruby Gems or on the Ruby ecosystem, and you're making, let's say, you're making $1 million a year, right? Is it something that you're not going to donate $5,000 a year to? Of course, you're going to donate $5,000 a year to it because just fundamentally, someone wants to de-risk your site going down or your deployment process going down. Like if you're unable to deploy for 2 days because Ruby Gems is down, right? You're in a really shit position, and there's CEOs who are coming into the VP of engineering or developers or whatever size you are, and yelling, why the fuck is the site down? Why haven't we been able to get this promotion out? Why haven't we been able to get this bug fixed? Whatever that is, and $5,000 is a trivial amount to make that happen. And I'm making this on a $1 million a year revenue thing. If you're Salesforce and you're making, or I don't know, $1 billion a year or 10 billion a year or whatever Salesforce makes, donating $1 million a year, 2 million a year, 10 million a year, it's small fry.
Well, to follow the money, I mean, Salesforce is actually Heroku.
Right, yeah.
Well, but that's exactly the point. I feel like a lot of these larger companies feel like they do that. Like you think about Google's and Facebook's, and like they do invest a lot in open source and employing these people.
But they're doing it for different reasons.
At one point, I feel like employed, this is me exaggerating, the maintainers of most of the major Apache projects at one point. Like these companies feel like they are, I think it's going to be hard set for them to be like, I'm going to support your project versus I'm going to write my own language Go and I'm going to start writing everything in Go.
Well, so I don't believe that it's supporting your project. I think the tie that you need to make is de-risk. I am being helped de-risk my business by putting money into making sure that these things don't happen.
And if you were paying for a service contract, I would believe the corporations would see it that way, but they're not. That's not what these.
I mean, there isn't a service contract available.
No, I know, but that's my point. Is I think that's why I don't see the line being that straight. I don't think.
I see what you're saying.
But the donation, I'm pro donation. I'm just saying it doesn't map, as you said before, it doesn't map into value delivered for the corporations.
There can be a more direct map than is being drawn now. Though I agree, it's not a service level agreement.
I have a question for all of you. So there's a new license that just came out recently called the Fair Source license. Have you seen this?
From SourceGraph.
Yeah, so it's interesting because basically it's not an open source license, but it's not a closed source license. Essentially, it says that here you can look at my source code, you can use it, but there's a limit on the number of users you can have before you start paying me, right? So it's not like you just take it, do whatever you want with it. I mean, most open source contracts are like, go do with it what you will. But Fair Source is like, you essentially can try it out until a certain point, at which point you start paying me.
It's more like a shareware.
It's shareware,
It's like shareware. It's a little bit unclear about how you enforce the limits. There's lots of questions, but I'm curious, is the solution in the licensing? Is the problem that the licenses now are too open? If Ruby came with a license that, listen, by the time you're making $10 million a year on a Ruby program, you have to give us $5,000, would that solve the problem? Because
there's a question of what is a Ruby program. So, for example, if let's say you're a big bank and you make more than $10 million a year, and everything's in Java, and there's a team that goes out and says, well, we're going to be doing some Ruby stuff now, and maybe you think that in the future everything will be Ruby, but right now it's one small thing. Is the bank going to say, oh, this is great, let's give our money to Ruby, or is the bank going to say Ruby is banned and you're not allowed to make anything Ruby?
Maybe. I don't know.
I think I really like the Fair Source license. I like the people behind it. The lawyer who drafted it, Heather Meeker, she's worked on Mozilla and like a bunch of other things. So she has a good mind for all that stuff. I think it'll be great for maybe some of those projects we were talking about where, let's call them smaller projects, air quotes, you have something that you're working on and you want to, charge fairly for it. I think it'll be a lot harder for stuff like, Python, for examal, to use.
But why? I mean, why? So why? I mean, why would the same rules not apply? No, seriously.
Why?
Sean gives us the five whys of the Kanban.
That's right. That was almost all 5 whys right there.
I think there are a lot of answers to that. My answer to it is just in looking at the history of open source in the first place, right? Like we worked for 20, 30 years to get all this stuff open for a reason. And it had these, I think when it started, maybe it was kind of more of this like political counterculture thing of like, we shouldn't like charge for something that should be free or whatever. Or like code should be free, anyone should be able to use it, no one owns this, whatever. But then you saw this like incredible explosion of startups, like in large part due to open source, which is something no one could have predicted, right? It's like when you create a platform and you give people access to that platform, they start making things that you could have never even dreamed of. It's so great. And like we should default to like having those kinds of tools for anybody to pick up and do something incredible with. And I want to protect that.
One of those things that's obvious in retrospect and not ahead of time.
Exactly.
I think GitHub's relationship with open source is fascinating.
Yeah, it is.
Like, you put in your article that like they fueled the explosion, but they're closed source.
Yep.
And I'd say now
they spent all day roll around and money. I mean, this is
And now there is a big petition from a bunch of open source people, like, why aren't you giving us all these tools? And I mean, the capitalist part of it, GitHub is like, well, we don't make any money off of these open source projects.
Yeah, it's really hard because they ended up, they make money off of enterprise.
I mean,
Yeah.
they make money off those open source projects.
Oh,
In a sense.
It's a freemium model. They got huge because because of all the open source. GitHub is the default. No one wants to use GitLab or whatever because of the network effects of open source. So to suggest that there's no value there, and that I'm sure that someone with a better analytical sense than me could actually put a dollar value on
Just
it.
look at SourceForge before them. I mean, SourceForge made money off opens before GitHub even existed. There was open source, right?
Right, but
So-
all of GitHub's value is derived from the fact that open source is all hosted
So
there.
here's a question then for you. So you're the product manager for GitHub.
Mm-hmm.
You get a long list of requests for features from open source, which doesn't pay you anything.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, you have a list of requests from enterprise customers,
Right.
and you're trying to put together your roadmap.
Well, so yeah, I agree that there's certainly a temptation to say fuck it. These guys are paying us money, and I think this is one of the very difficult lines to straddle. When you have that group of customers, you have to be very careful to keep them happy and to keep them there. And you can't please everybody, and you can't do everything, and you can't acquiesce to like demands and that sort of thing. But if open source was to leave GitHub, there's an existential crisis for GitHub.
Yep.
Totally. Yeah, I think it's just a balance that they're trying to find right now, because and this has been written about publicly too in articles and stuff, just about like internally right now in GitHub. There's sort of this tension between, do we double down on enterprise, but if we do too much of that, then we forget our there's just a little bit of turmoil, executives changing positions and stuff, and I think they're just going to have to try to figure it out because they realize that we might not directly make money, and this is kind of true of like open source businesses too, right? Of like, we might not directly make money off of that community, but without that community, the rest of it's kind of meaningless. So
I will say one benefit of GitHub, and I think the genius of GitHub actually, is that they've actually turned like what do you call corporate software to look more like the open source projects. Like
Right.
if
Yeah,
you go
it's a
back
great
before
equalizer.
GitHub, right? Like most closed source projects were managed much differently than open source. But today, everybody's on GitHub. We're all doing pull requests. We're
Yeah.
basically using
Yeah,
open
yeah.
source
Yeah.
software methodologies for closed source, which actually is in the favor of open source because it makes it seem less different. It doesn't seem strange.
right,
It's
Yeah.
not a different way of thinking.
Absolutely.
And it's actually interesting that there's a lot of the closed source methodology that people want GitHub to allow that GitHub refuses to allow. So for tighter integration with Jira or replacing the issues or replacing pull requests with something that involves like more code review or that sort of thing, GitHub is saying no, this is the way to do it, and so people, as you say, they end up much closer to open source than they would end up otherwise.
I would say that pull requests have helped fuel continuous delivery.
Oh,
continuous
just bring this
delivery.
on.
coincidence. What are the chances? Wow. I would also argue open source is fuel continuous delivery.
Oh, well, all right. Let's hear this.
Yes. I have nothing to back that up. I would say that.
So you're gonna argue with
I didn't say I was an arguer that. I would say this.
So I think it's interesting because people use continuous delivery when you want to deliver continuously. And open source fundamentally doesn't do that. For the most part, people release with almost Byzantine release models of like, we'll release something with a version number in like every quarter or whatever that thing is. If you're using small projects, the small projects will tend to like, you make a pull request, there's a new feature goes in or whatever, and then you're like, oh, I'd like to release a new one, and so you make a pull request with a new number or that sort of thing. And that is almost close to continuous delivery, except it's not actually continuous. There's no actual infrastructure, there's no automation. So yeah, I think open source isn't contributed to frequently enough to have continuous delivery and are generally not continuously delivered.
Although it's really hard to, this is a topic from their side, it's hard to have continuously delivered downloadable software, right? Because once I download
Not at all.
Like,
You just every single version of the software gets tagged with a branch name or a SHA or whatever.
There's nightly builds and stable builds in most of these projects.
Yeah, I mean, nightly and stable is continuous delivery.
Yeah, that was my argument.
I would argue that they don't exist for most of these projects. I would argue they occasionally exist on the larger projects.
Well, when they start making money, maybe they will.
Wait,
Tied it all together.
I thought you had an anecdote you were going to share.
So this is completely off topic, but a long time ago when I used to work at Verizon, this would have been a long time ago.
Weren't they? Did they have a hotline commercial?
Yes. So anyway, back when I used to work at Verizon, this is the phone company. I was a big proponent of open source at Verizon. And this is back when Linux was like, oh, scary stuff. What is that? And the big tagline was, Linux is not ready for prime time. This was the big thing. Like, oh, you can't use it in production because Linux is not ready for prime time. And here was Sean saying, Linux is ready for prime time. And I managed to succeed in creating this little bubble inside Verizon of let's use open source. Let's get it through. And I actually was invited to speak at a Linux conference here. The first time I've ever been to San Francisco, right? I lived in the Northeast. I'd never been to California. I flew all the way to San Francisco to speak at a Linux conference. And they weren't even that big. I mean, this is maybe 4 rooms in one of the hotels around here. And I got here, and my talk was starting in an hour, and I got a phone call from my boss saying that the lawyers at Verizon were afraid that they were going to get sued, because this is back when people were suing you if you use Linux because it was infringing on the patents of other companies.
That's crazy.
And I got prohibited from going on stage because I flew all the way here. An hour before my talk, they're like, you can't go on stage because if you go on stage, people will sue us because they'll hear you talking about the fact we use Linux.
That is a phone call that you don't answer.
I should.
An hour before any talk, you do not answer the phone from your boss.
This is why, like, when Paul and I go on speeches, I try to get a hold of him, and he's like,
Yeah. I thought they were calling to wish me luck. I didn't think they were going to be like, nope, sorry, nope, you can't go on. So let's all admit we've come farther than that, which is great.
Absolutely, yeah.
So funny, a similar thing happened to me. I was one of my first internships was I was working at Sony in London, Sony Computer Entertainment Europe, and my job was to port the iToy driver to PS2 Linux, which was the open source hobbyist version of Linux. And I made the transition, I ported it, whatever, and we went to release it, and we did release it. And then the Monday after, I got an email from my boss saying, "Sorry, we had to pull it. The lawyers didn't particularly like this, and it was an actual IP issue. It wasn't like we're afraid of open source issue. It was like someone else owned the library that had been ported, and there was some magic numbers in there, and so we were going to do something where there was 2 kernel modules instead. It never got done." But yeah, lawyers.
Yeah, there we go. So if we agree, we're going to get rid of all the lawyers. We're going to pay all the open source people. I mean, we've got a lot of progress on this podcast.
We're going to use the money that we used to pay the lawyers.
To San Francisco.
We're going to use the money that we used to pay the lawyers to pay the open source people.
What would we do with all that? There's too much money. We wouldn't have anything to do with it.
So we haven't really touched on something that I actually was very curious about. You said in your article that you thought VCs were not willing to fund open source.
I call it not venture backable. Well, specifically the infrastructure stuff I'm talking about, and I guess language is part of this problem. VCs back plenty of open source businesses and plenty of infrastructure, especially stuff around DevOps and data infrastructure. Obviously, you guys are both venture backed, and so, or you guys, you can't see where my hands are going. But yeah, so I mean, like, absolutely, there's a place for venture and open source.
They backed NPM.
That's right. Yep, they did. But I think
is that not infrastructure?
It is absolutely infrastructure.
Okay.
I think that it's in our best interest, especially looking at the history of open source, to keep it a public good, for better or worse terminology, in the sense that, like, we're all benefiting and we're all using it, and so it should be something that is a tool that anybody can pick up and use.
This sounds like communism.
Yeah,
I'm so sorry. I said the word. I got distracted by the door, and I said the word public good. I should have never said it. I take it back.
There's like a range. Like, I agree. The reality, venture backable is the right way to think about it, because the reality is most of these really valuable, I don't want to call them infrastructure, I'm going to call them really valuable open source projects, are not going to grow fast enough to have venture-backed returns, right? Venture-backed returns are a very specific kind of business return.
And some of them don't even have business models, period.
But even if they did, they just wouldn't grow fast. Like, Python's been slow burning forever, right? This is not a fast growth business. Yeah. Ruby, the same thing. Like, there's things that are so fundamental now that we use that just aren't fast growth, that are going to produce venture-backed returns, even if they had a business model associated with them. Like, Ruby toiled in obscurity for years until Rails came out. Like, let's be honest, these things are non-linear.
So this is funny. You talked in your tweets about people investing in programming languages, or has anyone ever made money from programming languages? So my PhD was in compilers, and I remember being at a conference where I talked to one of the guys who made this, I wouldn't say important compiler, but it was a company that people had heard of, people in the compiler community had heard of. And he said that 85% of compiler companies have one customer. Wow. And the one customer was, like, basically providing the services, they had a service contract with them. They were building it for that one customer who used it in one particular case.
That's not venture backable.
It's not only is it not venture backable, but, like, I mean, with compilers, and again, programming languages is the same sort of thing. You're competing with free, or you're competing with some other company who's providing it for some internal benefit that they have. The Googles of the world are contributing to GCC. Apple is contributing to LLVM. If you come out with another C compiler, no one is really going to. No one's going to make money off it. And so Circle CI is where I ended up as like the closest possible thing that could make money to being a compiler company.
That's awesome.
That's great. I never heard the origin story before. That's awesome.
So I'd like to say, in full disclosure, Sean is actually an advisor and an investor in LaunchDarkly, so he obviously believes
That's
that
why
we
he
will
just
have.
only says nice things about me.
He obviously believes that we will have exponential growth and pay for his kids' college education.
That'd be nice because it'd be expensive by then.
Yeah.
It'll be education will be done by then. There won't be any universities.
That's true.
They will all have risen up about their student
Sounds
debts
like
and-
communism.
Well, Paul is from Europe.
There you go. Nice.
Yeah. I mean, so
Where
just-
education is free.
I will say, I mean, I think there's a good distinction between a lifestyle and a VC-backed business. VCs want to get exponential returns because they're betting that, like, of the 10 companies they invest in, 9 will probably fail and 1 will have to make up for all that return.
Yep.
So they're actually not
So,
looking. They're not looking for a steady 5 or 10% return a year.
Well, there's this interesting pathological case of open source. I don't think it happens very frequently, but let's take the example of NPM for a second, right? So you have Node comes out as a language, and it's really interesting and has a lot of interesting things.
It's growing much faster than most other languages.
And growing really fast. And then you have NPM, which is a package manager for Node, which actually in some ways is more interesting and has more economic value than the language itself, right?
Right.
And so NPM can raise venture money. They can build a business around it. And like, this is an interesting, I don't think this happens very frequently, but this is an obvious case of economic disequilibrium, right? Where NPM wouldn't have existed without Node, right? And now actually NPM today actually does exist a little bit without Node. You can use it to manage packages that are not Node packages. But like, this company, if it sold for $1 billion, right, what does it owe back to the Node?
This goes back to your Red Hat.
right.
Yep.
Yeah,
I
like,
mean, is it going to be like, I'm going to give you a bunch of shares and maybe you can buy a house or maybe a nice car while I go off and buy an island? Or like, how do you...
And
Well,
it's particularly funny since Node was built by Joyent, or
Right.
with Joyent as their corporate sponsor, and before it was cast out into the whatever happened there. So who enjoys the economic goodness that came out from it? Is it the people who started it, or is it Node, or is it Joyent?
I mean, this actually has its roots in the 1600s, where
Going way back.
what?
Going way back.
Yeah, I mean, what was scientific?
Source code back then was made on the frontier.
They had to use calf skin. No, no, I mean the whole thing about the scientific community went through the same spasms of who really gets credit for a new discovery. Who, what you said about NPM and Node. It's like, well, one wasn't possible, but the other amplified its effect. It's the same with discovery of calculus. It's like the famous quote was, "I could do this because I stood on the shoulder of giants."
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
we have the ability to build all these infrastructure companies now because we do have the foundation of languages, because we do have the foundation of compilers.
Right. And it's giants on top of giants on top of giants at this point.
It's all turtles, dude.
It's giants is about giants and giants are little bitty turtle.
It's actually a great analogy. I mean, if we're going to go back to the 1600s, I'll go back to like the beginning.
Back when I was a kid.
It'll turn out there was a Medici at the end of it at some point.
Right, yeah, that's right. You started this. But just comparing it to highways and cars in the United States, I actually wanted to write something about this as an allegory. So like we have an interstate highway system right now, right? You can take road to go from one side of the country to the other. That happened in like the 50s or 60s. It got started. But they've been trying to do it since I think like the 20s.
And it was actually communism was the reason why they did it.
I thought it was lobbying.
No, it was
I thought
because
it
they
was
were
lobbying by the car companies.
they were
that
afraid
caused
the
it all.
Russians would invade, and they needed it to get tanks quick.
I think it was aliens. I'm just throwing it out there.
So not the other kind of communism.
That was part of
Not America's being communist to provide all these things. It's like fear of communism. Right.
That was part of it. That there's also another part of it, which was that cars started in like the late 1800s or whatever, and they weren't really they were slowly kind of growing, right? But they hadn't hit a point of really being used by consumers everywhere. And suddenly, after World War II, we had sort of like mass production happening, and everyone was like, all right, like we want to be able to drive anywhere and do anything with these roads, but it was a really shitty system. And so Eisenhower ended up championing it during his presidency, and the argument that he made for an interstate highway system was really similar to, I guess, like the need for better infrastructure with open source too, which was like, if we can connect everything together, so much more prosperity can happen on top of this highway system. So it's not just consumers driving together or citizens driving around and like seeing each other, but it's also like trucking companies can drive across and transport goods from one place to another. Tons of people are going to make money off of having a more efficient system.
Well, so to perhaps draw a failure in this analogy, there was a very convenient federal system that was already taxing all the people
Right.
that could actually build this thing, and I don't think that
And that's,
exists.
that's exactly the
So are you
problem.
suggesting that this should exist in open
It
source?
should. Yeah.
Well, and
I would say, but it's even
not
worse than that.
Sorry, just to clarify, I don't believe we should have this sort of like unified, whatever, centralized system.
Federal government
But just,
of
I already have the forms drafted
just-
up, actually.
No,
so.
I just want to clarify this point. I just mean that that was kind of the point, right? There was somebody to kind of step in and help fund it, but we all
Right,
agree
right.
that this should exist. And when we talk about
I
physical,
think though,
don't-
if you were
well-
to build this federal system, I think VCs would fund that.
yeah, to be super clear, I do not want a federal system of.
But I think that allegory, that's a really good allegory because it brings up the most important point. It took the only proven wealth redistribution mechanism we know, which is government to do
Government.
that, right?
Yeah. Mhm.
So the reality is we're probably not going to have government step in open source.
Right.
But we've never seen a privatized wealth redistribution
Right.
at that scale work.
I mean, we do have governments in open source. We have governing bodies. There's the Apache stuff,
But they
and
don't have
there's a bunch of-
taxation rights.
They could have. I mean,
I wasn't
sort
referring to
of have
government as
taxation
governance.
rights.
I was saying wealth redistribution was the idea of taxation and
Right, but
reinvestment
so
for the common
those
good.
foundations and communities are receiving money from the member organizations.
Sure. I'm talking about the scale of all, like if Apache was all of open source, I think that would be true. But again, we're talking about a larger undertaking here, right?
It kind of goes back to that united way of open source.
There's
right?
a
Like, no-
model here that could grow into a united way of.
Potentially.
And I'd say one more thing. So I love Nadia's analogy. There's a huge issue right now that all these bridges were built in the 1950s and 60s.
Yeah.
And they're crumbling now. Because it's one of those things where it's
Because we're
like,
supposed to have flying cars. Let me just throw that out there.
drones.
We don't need roads anymore.
No, it's this issue. It's very much like open source. You know, it's like this issue of deferred maintenance, and it's somebody else's problem.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, these bridges that were rated for 50 years, like their 50 years are here.
And the funny thing about physical infrastructure like bridges is it's one of the few issues that everybody no matter how you politically affiliate, everybody agrees that we should have a better infrastructure system. So it's like very non-threatening politically.
But
I
the
think-
bridges.
but they still don't get done because it's not a sexy topic and no one wants to fund maintenance. But like even with open source infrastructure, like we don't even all agree that this needs to happen. I think that's kind of like the first step is that like, all right, we do need to figure out how to support it. What that looks like is we can talk about that. But
Well,
even agreeing
if
there
we
is a
can't
problem.
agree why we need to support it, and I think that there is quite some disagreement over that, then we're never going to agree on how.
Yeah.
Is there the flip side? Is it true that all open source projects would welcome this kind of? I'm just thinking the case of Hudson, right? So Hudson was an open source continuous build server that was ostensibly run by the community that Oracle tried to.
It's one of
step
these
in and-
old ones. It doesn't work very well, and
It's
you
not nearly
should
as good as
generally
Circle
look for
CI.
more
Go to
modern.
circleci.com, sign up. If you use the code Sean Byrnes, you actually have to pay 10% more, so don't use that one. But the idea was Oracle was like, the parent company, and they were like, forget you, we're renaming it Jenkins and we're creating a new one, right? And so they actually resisted having, I don't know what you would call it, like
Corporate overlord.
corporate overlord. And so I wonder if even if this did exist, if it is a universal case that all projects would, the important ones, right, would accept this kind of help, like on terms that were not theirs, like would they, if we could even do it, if we could snap our fingers.
Yeah, we absolutely should not do it on terms that are not theirs. I think the question is not do all projects need it, but do enough important ones need it that this is worth looking
What
at.
are the
Well,
terms that people
let me be
want
more
to know?
specific. Would they accept them on similar enough terms that you could have a generalizable solution? Is more what I mean.
I
I
think-
agree with you
yeah.
that we shouldn't dictate to them, but the problem is if they all want it slightly differently,
Yeah.
there is no general solution then.
Yeah, I think that's actually one of the hardest parts is that every ecosystem is different, or everyone has different needs and different histories, and so you can't just say, "Here's $1 million, like it's fixed now," right? And so it really, and I think that's kind of the fun part is I think of it as sort of like open source infrastructure needs a developer evanelism team, or it needs a community manager or something,
a
right?
sales team.
Or it's sounding more and more like a corporation.
It needs HR and finance.
I think of it more as like stewards and coming from a nonprofit background, like I think of it as like stewards and advocacy, not like sales and product and like
Oh, it
need to
needs
like
sales and product.
MBA the shit out of this.
Open
like, I
source
don't know.
needs sales and product more than it needs anything else.
It's funny because we always project what we like. I actually can see from Nadia's perspective, we're in nonprofits, and I can see from your perspective working in for-profit. I think there's often a tendency, let's superimpose what's worked on open source because clearly open source is not working. The problem is like, I don't even know if that's a solution, right? Do we need something that's totally new, something that we have never seen before? Like communism.
So let's suppose $1 million arrived tomorrow for Python, right? Let's say $1 million a year arrived tomorrow for the use of Python. How would that be used? How would it be distributed? What are the conditions by which people get paid by this? Who gets paid by it? How does that work?
Do we pay out everybody who once contributed?
Yeah.
I mean,
that's
is there
hard
some?
too.
Yeah.
Because I think this has happened with grants in the past, or even right now for open source projects where like they'll give them a grant for like 3 years, for example, but then it's like, well, what happens after those 3 years? And that's even a problem in nonprofits and philanthropy, right? Like you don't want to just sort of get somebody hooked to this like drip of capital and they just need the money over and over. And, there has to be some sort of like integration into sustainability and impact. And so like, I mean, I don't have any magical answers. I think that the one commonality that I've seen across a lot of projects that need more support is that there isn't any sort of like non-coding function that's really celebrated or encouraged.
Right. There's no love for product management
or even like documentation to like help people get started, right? So it's like, why aren't people contributing? Well, maybe because they can't figure out how to get started, right? And like, so investing into those kinds of things, maybe it's not always about like direct payment or whatever, but it's like, how can we help like build the ecosystem around the code so that it's then easier to kind of like pick up and contribute to.
So to ask it a different way, if the people who are looking for the money had their way, how would it be spent?
It really depends on the people, which I think is part of the problem.
What have some people said, or what's the biggest opinion, or the top two, or something?
The maintainers themselves have, I think, a pretty like straightforward approach to it, which is like, we want a salary for this, and it's like, and I don't think they've put as much thought maybe into like how that actually works, and that's the part that I'm trying to sort out.
So there's the top 5 or 10 people get like a proper like Silicon Valley wage out of it, or
or just even being able to like pay rent and take care of their families, basic stuff.
And so they want to be able to work on it full time.
Yeah.
And so work for, let's say, Python or something versus working for Heroku on Python.
Right. And so one thing that I think might help in the short term is matching up some of those maintainers with companies that are willing to hire them to work full time on their projects, because that is happening right now already. And I think sometimes when I've talked to developers who've tried to negotiate that for themselves with companies,
it's a really tough
it's been
sell.
hard. Yeah, it's a really tough sell.
It's like you're basically saying like, hey, hire me to not work on anything that.
Exactly. And it happens right now. Like people, it does, like it's already a practice. And that's why
I think when that happens, it happens because there's a company that already knows the value of doing this. And so they try to recruit that person rather. And often they'll negotiate like a 50-50, like with Guido at Google. Well, he's now Dropbox, but originally when he went to Google, there was like a 50-50 time thing.
Yeah.
So I actually had a follow-up question for both of you. One was for Paul, and it's interesting because you come from a developer background. Why are you advocating for sales and marketing for open source?
Because people don't donate, so you need a sales team to go and get those donations. So and I think that there's no doubt that if you showed up at the a bunch of unicorns' doors and said, here's the risk factors that you face, here's the economic downside.
I've seen this in a movie, and it was set with the mafia.
I'd actually rather go to the Fortune 500 because the unicorns are looking at the stock market being like, shit.
Okay, maybe it's the Fortune 500s, but like you turn up at people who have both money and risk on a certain problem, and you put a dollar value on that risk, and you say, here's what you should do to mitigate that risk. And I mean, no one is saying like, we'll put a horse's head in your bed, but we're saying like, you can donate or you can not donate, and here's the risk. Here's the heartbleed thing that happened, or here's what happens if all the credit cards in your system, which are being protected by this thing, which is like one maintainer only on Tuesdays, then you can say, give us some money, and then you can direct the money to good places. And there's questions as to how the good places need to go, but like getting the money in, I think, is the first thing, and then you can have the conversation about how should we actually spend it.
I think this is fascinating because always the sell for developer tools is, developers don't want sales or marketing; they just want to use it.
No, you're right. Developers don't want sales and marketing. What you need sales for is to make an enterprise sale. You need to find the champions within the organization. You need to find the people with the purse strings, and you need to make an economic case to them as to why they should spend
An offer
that money.
they can't refuse.
And make an economic case as to why they should spend the money.
Man, your infrastructure is looking pretty rickety.
That's awesome.
And then you have to like keep the process going.
So you got to come around every week and like
make sure that they're happy. Okay, well, this sounds exactly.
I'm with you.
I'm pretty sure Horsehead was HTTP code 702 or something like that. So I have one last
but that's
question.
fundamentally a sales process, and it's not like a developer process. Like you can't just say, oh, this should happen and expect a company to do it, or expect developers within an organization to try and make that happen. There's a specific skill set to managing this process, to getting that money out of people, and to signing all the things, and that's called sales. That's what salespeople do.
That I'm totally on board with.
So why is it, this one last question, which is, if there is so much economic disequilibrium that exists, so much friction exists between these projects that people are working on and open source that are relying on large companies, why is it that capitalism doesn't kick in and companies do erupt? Even if it's not the maintainer, somebody else, like a side company, erupts to mitigate the risk the large companies feel, so that that jump up and fill that gap. Because if there is this potential, if there is this money, that the risk has an economic value, capitalism would dictate that companies would erupt into this void, even if it's not the maintainer.
So there's a couple of ones that have. So for example, Ruby stopped maintaining, I don't know, version 2.3, or maybe it was Rails stopped maintaining version 2.3, and this German company came in and said, there's a bunch of companies who are stuck on Rails 2.3. We are going to support Rails 2.3. We're going to backport security fixes and all that sort of thing. And they sold licenses for I think it was like $10,000 a year or something along those lines. They got a ton of customers and they made a ton of money.
I think another thing is that the risk is so dispersed. I mean, so basically, my mafia jokes have said what you're selling is insurance, but it's not insurance on any one given point of it. We're kind of back to the United States of infrastructure,
right?
Where to have
someone will fix your pothole.
Yeah, well, but to have 70 different people come by your office to advocate for their little corner is not sustainable. There's not enough economy of scale.
If people did know, if they knew exactly how much money was out there, would the void be filled by? Is it merely a communication problem? Would companies just erupt around these problems?
To me, it goes back to unit economic scale. If you're hiring a salesperson to go and extract $20 from 3 million different companies, that's not enough to afford a salesperson.
Yeah.
I think there's a related thing to this, that developers don't want to make companies and they don't want to sell. They like to write code, they like to write software, and they don't want, and often don't know how to take the value that they bring and attach a price tag to it and find the people who will pay that price tag.
Well, so Sean, actually, you're a developer and you started a company.
Well, I will say that I think that a lot of developers don't know how. I don't know that they do it because they don't want to. They just wouldn't even know how when put in that position.
That's something I hear over and over and over again from developers is I would really, really love if someone would pay me for this and however you want to pay them. Mm-hmm. But I just don't even know where to start. I don't know where to go.
Even I think if they did know where to start, the work starts to look significantly different than the work that they actually want to do.
Exactly.
So as we've all started companies, we know what that's like. You don't write code when you're starting a company. You talk to customers, you work on product, you hire people, you raise money, and very, very little of it actually looks like.
You go to the
writing
Institute
code.
of Open Source, you fill out your triplicate forms, and it takes a long time. Right.
Well, so my last, I think we're close to time, so my last question for Nadia is tied in. Why do you think you said something interesting about technical documentation?
Yeah, I just thought of it as an example of, people might disagree around sales and marketing or get kind of freaked out by those terms. But even documentation, I think of it as something that's, it's not literally writing code, but it's extremely important just to help people communicate with each other, right? And so it's kind of a technical and acknowledged function in open source, but that doesn't always get enough love.
I think it's also, I'll say it up front, technical documentation never gets much love.
Never does, yeah. And that, how do you get started with a new project? You read, right?
This is why people hire people to write documentation.
Yeah.
Because developers like to write code, they don't like to write documentation, and they don't have particularly good skill sets at it. So
Yeah.
you need people who have that skill set.
And next week we talk about continuous documentation.
Well, I'd like to give a huge thank you to our two guests. This was
you
the
guys have
first.
been awesome.
Thanks for having us.
This
Yeah,
was the
thanks.
first time we had two guests. So any final words?
Go open source. Support your favorite projects.
Yeah, what he said.
Thanks for listening to this episode of To Be Continuous, brought to you by HeavyBit and hosted by me, Paul Bigger of Circle CI, and Edith Harbaugh of Launch Darkly.
To learn more about HeavyBit, visit heavybit.com. While you're there, check out their library, home to great educational talks from other developer company founders and industry leaders.